The Battle of Stalingrad, which formally ended with the surrender of Field Marshal Paulus and the entire Sixth Army on February 2, 1943, was not simply a major military defeat. It represented the absolute psychological and strategic end of the Blitzkrieg myth that had successfully sustained Nazi Germany's war efforts and national morale for over 3 years. The catastrophic loss of nearly 300,000 men who were encircled and either perished or became prisoners shattered the promise that German genius could achieve swift, decisive, and relatively cheap victory over the Soviet Union. For Adolf Hitler, who had personally staked his political and military reputation on the capture of the city named after his adversary, the loss was an unparalleled public humiliation. The sheer, unprecedented scale of the casualty figures and the total obliteration of an entire elite German field army marked an irreversible strategic turning point, compelling a reluctant and slow acknowledgement within the high command that the war was no longer about easy conquest, but about a brutal, costly, and existential struggle for survival. While the catastrophic defeat was a shock to the German military establishment, the impact on the German home front was immediate, profound, and overwhelmingly negative. For the very first time in the war, the normally omnipotent propaganda ministry was reluctantly forced to acknowledge a catastrophic failure instead of confidently reporting another victory. Joseph Goebbels attempted to manage the public fallout by declaring 3 days of national mourning, but the deep, stunned silence of the German populace was far more telling than any official pronouncement or ceremony. Thousands upon thousands of German families lost fathers, sons, and brothers in a single, devastating moment, and the casualty lists were too immense and too localized to be fully concealed. This tragic moment firmly planted the first significant, widespread seeds of doubt and profound fear among ordinary Germans about the Führer's infallible competence and the promised swift, glorious victory corroding internal morale. The catastrophic loss of over 250,000 men at Stalingrad was not just an alarming statistic. It fundamentally and irrevocably changed the crucial balance of military power on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht's entire strategic and tactical doctrine relied heavily on highly trained, aggressive, and experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, NCOs. The Sixth Army, often lauded as one of the best formations, contained a disproportionate number of these irreplaceable men. The Soviets, meanwhile, possessed immense, almost inexhaustible reserves of manpower that could be quickly mobilized and deployed. Hitler's gradual, painful realization was that Germany, with its limited population, declining birth rate, and strict racial criteria for conscription, had fallen hopelessly into an unwinnable attrition trap. For every highly trained soldier Germany lost in the relentless fighting, the Soviets could mobilize 2 or 3 more replacements. This harsh demographic reality, brutally exposed by the Stalingrad campaign, meant Germany could no longer win a long war of attrition. Beyond the irreversible loss of manpower, Stalingrad destroyed Germany's material superiority in a way no previous battle had managed. The entire Sixth Army's complete supply of tanks, heavy artillery, vital transport vehicles, and specialized equipment was completely obliterated, abandoned, or captured by the Soviets. More critically, the extraordinary effort required to supply the vast and demanding Eastern Front meant that replacement rates for armored divisions across the entire Wehrmacht were already dangerously slow. Hitler began the slow, agonizing realization that the famed German Panzer Corps, the very symbol and engine of blitzkrieg power, could no longer be fully or quickly reconstituted to their 1941 strength. From the start of 1943 onward, German forces were perpetually forced into battle, fighting with fewer tanks, less artillery support, and increasingly less reliable logistics than their burgeoning enemy. Stalingrad also starkly highlighted a devastating strategic vulnerability that Hitler and the OKW could no longer plausibly ignore: the chronic and worsening fuel crisis. The entire Soviet campaign had been driven by the desperate, paramount need to secure the crucial Caucasus oil fields, an objective which Germany ultimately and catastrophically failed to achieve. The logistical nightmare of supplying the Stalingrad operation alone consumed unimaginable quantities of petroleum and diesel. Post-Stalingrad, the remaining Luftwaffe units and the armoured panzer divisions were forced into a perpetual and severe state of fuel rationing. This dependence on highly vulnerable synthetic fuel plants and the lack of captured natural oil meant that German strategic mobility, the core strength of the Blitzkrieg, was permanently crippled. Hitler now faced a war where his armies could no longer move freely and decisively across the vast European theatre. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the Stalingrad surrender, a massive strategic crisis erupted across the entire southern flank of the Eastern Front. With the elite Sixth Army destroyed and gone, the entire German line was dangerously exposed and vulnerable to a massive Soviet counteroffensive. Only the brilliant defensive counteroffensives masterminded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein prevented a total collapse of the front, culminating in the temporary recapture of Kharkov. However, this was clearly a strategic defensive victory born purely of necessity, skill, and desperation, not inherent strength or a return to offensive capability. Hitler was thus forced to accept a deep, strategic retreat, surrendering hundreds of square miles of hard-won territory. This grudging, forced acceptance of large-scale withdrawal was the first time Hitler, fundamentally and ideologically opposed to the concept of retreat, was forced by irrefutable military reality to concede massive ground to the enemy. Despite the clear and overwhelming signs of strategic exhaustion and material inferiority, Hitler stubbornly refused to fully accept that Germany was permanently defeated. His strategic realization was slow, painful, and dangerously incomplete. Driven by denial, he authorized Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk, in the summer of 1943, as his last, desperate, large-scale offensive effort. He falsely believed a crushing victory there would magically restore morale, stabilize the front, and re-establish the German initiative. However, the prolonged preparation time allowed the Soviets to create deep, multi-layered defensive lines, meaning the subsequent attack failed catastrophically after just a few weeks. The Battle of Kursk, which ended decisively in July 1943, was the final strategic nail in the coffin. It proved beyond all doubt that the Wehrmacht could no longer launch a successful blitzkrieg offensive capable of making decisive operational gains. Hitler's focus on the critical fighting in the East was violently and unexpectedly interrupted in the summer of 1943 by catastrophic news from the South. The swift Allied invasion of Sicily in July, immediately followed by the shocking overthrow of Benito Mussolini by his own government. This sequence of events was a profound, personal, and geopolitical shock to Hitler. It proved that his entire Axis ally system was rapidly crumbling, and critically, it forced Germany to divert vital, irreplaceable armoured divisions and air power from the Eastern Front to hold the line in Italy and forcibly disarm the unreliable Italian army. The necessity of garrisoning and defending the entire Italian peninsula was an entirely unplanned, devastating commitment of resources that confirmed the war had indeed become a global, resource-draining, two-front struggle. Stalingrad and its strategic fallout formalized the strategic nightmare of the two-front war that Germany had sought desperately to avoid since 1939. From 1943 onward, Hitler realized he was permanently locked into a defensive war on two massive, relentless fronts: the inexorable Soviet advance in the east and the rapidly growing threat of Allied invasion in the south, Italy, and the west, France. Critically, this strategic overextension required perpetually splitting finite resources equally, preventing Germany from ever concentrating the decisive, overwhelming force needed to defeat either enemy decisively. This unfixable strategic overextension, directly caused by the failed commitment at Stalingrad, became the defining, unavoidable, and ultimately fatal reality of the last 2 years of the war. The forced shift of German industrial production and limited air defense resources towards supporting the critical, collapsing Eastern Front, made desperately necessary by Stalingrad's colossal material losses, directly and quickly accelerated the collapse of the Luftwaffe's superiority in the West. By 1943, the German industrial heartland was left increasingly vulnerable to devastating, round-the-clock Anglo-American strategic bombing raids. Hitler began the grim realization that the war in the air was now decisively and permanently lost. The ability of the Allies to bomb German cities, oil plants, and factories with near impunity meant that the replacement rate for tanks, aircraft, and fuel was rapidly falling behind overwhelming enemy production, a clear and fatal sign that Germany was being irrevocably strangled economically. Prior to Stalingrad, Hitler, for all his strategic flaws and prejudices, had dictated the pace, location, and objective of the fighting across Europe. Post-Stalingrad and post-Kursk, the German army had irrevocably lost the operational initiative. From the latter half of 1943 until the war's final conclusion, the Soviet Red Army, and later the Western Allies, decided where and when to strike. German forces were perpetually forced into a reactive, defensive posture, rushing inadequate reserves to meet the next massive Soviet offensive thrust. Hitler's slow, agonizing realization was that he was no longer the all-conquering Führer, but a reactive defender, destined only to lose ground, bleed his irreplaceable army dry, and ultimately manage an inevitable, protracted defeat. Stalingrad damaged Hitler's fundamental political standing and personal authority more severely than any other single event of the war. The carefully cultivated aura of the infallible genius, the man who could do no wrong and predicted every victory, was irrevocably shattered. Even among his most loyal functionaries and inner circle, whispered doubts about his strategic competence and sanity began to surface. Hitler responded to this profound internal political threat by becoming exponentially more paranoid, isolated, and obsessively dictatorial. He accelerated the replacement of old guard, conservative military men with fiercely loyal Nazi functionaries, ensuring that all subsequent strategic decisions prioritized ideological rigidity and personal loyalty over objective, sound military judgment, tragically guaranteeing further defeat. Acknowledging the irreparable damage to both the military and civilian morale, Hitler finally authorized Joseph Goebbels to deliver his famous impassioned total war speech in February 1943, immediately following the Stalingrad defeat. This speech was a desperate, theatrical attempt to rally the demoralized German people to a final, superhuman effort, but it also contained a chilling, implicit admission of failure. The easy, glorious victories were definitively over, and the country now faced an existential, deadly struggle for national survival. By demanding total mobilization, closing theaters, conscripting women for factory work, and drafting older men, the Nazi regime formally ended the Blitzkrieg era and finally imposed the full, painful, and exhausting reality of total war on the German populace. The surrender and mass capture of the Sixth Army led to the capture of hundreds of high-ranking German officers, many of whom subsequently joined the anti-Hitler National Committee for a free Germany while in Soviet captivity. For Hitler, this was not just a crushing military loss, but a deep, unforgivable personal betrayal by the officer corps who had sworn personal oaths of loyalty. His subsequent realization that his generals were rapidly losing faith accelerated his institutional mistrust of the entire Wehrmacht as a body. This mutual loss of faith on both sides led directly to an increased, debilitating centralization of command, with Hitler obsessively micromanaging battles down to the regiment level, further paralyzing the army's ability to react flexibly and effectively on the fluid Eastern Front. The strategic failure in the East forced Hitler to confront the grim reality of the Soviet Union's relocated and rapidly expanding industrial power. By 1943, the Soviets were producing significantly more tanks, especially the rugged T-34, more artillery, and more tactical aircraft than the entire German industrial base could possibly replace, despite the latter's best efforts and regardless of constant Allied bombing. Stalingrad proved, beyond any lingering doubt, that Germany could no longer match Soviet output, transforming the conflict from a strategic war of movement and maneuver into a brutal, unwinnable war of industrial attrition. Hitler realized the narrow window for German military-industrial supremacy had closed forever. The destruction of the Sixth Army necessitated the immediate, grinding, and strategically painful withdrawal of the German Army Group A from the entire Caucasus region, the primary objective of the entire 1942 summer offensive. The failure to capture the crucial Baku oil fields was the single greatest, unfixable strategic error of the campaign. Hitler was forced to relinquish the entire resource-rich region and retreat hundreds of miles to avoid the complete encirclement and destruction of Army Group A. This massive retreat was a tacit, undeniable admission that the grand strategic goals of the entire operation, securing vital resources for the long war, had failed completely, and that Germany was now permanently destined to fight the war on its own dwindling, finite resources. Despite the intense strategic crisis unfolding in the East, Hitler ordered a massive, costly reallocation of Germany's critically scarce resources to construct and reinforce the Atlantic Wall in the West, convinced the main Allied invasion was imminently due. This disastrous decision, driven by his desperate desire to avoid a two-front land war, directly drained immense resources: concrete, steel, specialized manpower, and irreplaceable heavy artillery that were desperately needed to hold the crumbling Eastern Front. Hitler's strategic realization was dangerously incomplete. He knew he had to retreat and reorganize in the East, but he mistakenly believed he could solve the Western threat through static, concrete defense, further misallocating the last of Germany's essential material resources. The flow of severely wounded and frostbitten veterans returning from the Eastern Front became a painful, visible, and persistent symbol of the catastrophe. Hospitals across Germany were quickly overflowing, and the common sight of men with horrific injuries, often missing limbs or suffering from severe psychological trauma, profoundly undermined the official propaganda narratives of glorious victories. These scarred veterans served as a silent yet powerful counter-narrative to Goebbels' reassuring promises, providing undeniable, visceral proof to the home front that the war was a brutal, destructive bloodbath that Germany was definitively and rapidly losing. The essential tone of Nazi propaganda underwent a critical, lasting, and fundamental change in 1943. It completely abandoned the confident language of easy victory, racial superiority, and world domination, shifting entirely to desperate themes of fanatical defense and existential survival. The new focus turned overwhelmingly to the fear of brutal Bolshevik revenge, savage Allied vengeance, and ultimate racial extinction to motivate and terrorize the German populace into continued effort. Hitler's realization that Germany could no longer possibly win the war by conquest meant he had to attempt to win by terror and ideological desperation, binding the people to the regime through a shared, pervasive fear of the enemy. Post-Stalingrad, the prospect of a negotiated conditional peace, which some pragmatic military figures had secretly hoped for, became entirely impossible. The Allies, sensing total, final victory, immediately and formally adopted a policy of unconditional surrender at the Casablanca Conference. For Hitler, this uncompromising stance meant there was absolutely no way out of the conflict but through total, fanatical resistance to the bitter, destructive end. His realization that the Allies would accept nothing less than the utter destruction and unconditional surrender of the Nazi regime drove him to increasingly desperate, destructive, and often illogical military decisions, tragically seeing his own personal survival and the survival of Germany as inextricably linked. By the final months of 1943, after the catastrophic failure of Kursk and the chaos in Italy, the devastating strategic truth was finally, tragically inescapable. Germany was losing the war, and the scale of the strategic defeat at Stalingrad had ensured it was a loss from which they could never recover. Hitler's full realization was a slow, toxic process of grudging and incomplete acceptance that culminated in late 1943. He finally understood that every subsequent battle would only serve to hasten the inevitable defeat. His overarching strategy shifted fundamentally from seeking outright victory to merely prolonging the struggle to hold out long enough for some miracle, the Wunderwaffen, or a major political break among the Allies, to appear. This permanent shift from offensive belief to defensive desperation defined his remaining command. To cope with the dawning, painful reality of material and strategic defeat, Hitler retreated even further into the delusion of Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons. He poured immense, unsustainable resources into V-2 rockets, jet aircraft programs, and advanced U-boats. This was a direct psychological consequence of the strategic defeat at Stalingrad, a refusal to accept the reality of attrition and material inferiority. Instead of using his rapidly dwindling resources to critically reinforce the collapsing Eastern Front, he dangerously diverted them to technologically complex, future-based solutions that were always maddeningly months away from deployment and ultimately lacked the scale to reverse the strategic situation. As the Wehrmacht was relentlessly pushed back by the Soviets, Hitler was finally forced to abandon his previous, rigid strategy of holding every single inch of ground. He authorized the massive construction of the Eastern Wall, often called the Panther-Wotan Line, a series of deep defensive fortifications hundreds of miles behind the constantly moving existing front line. This monumental construction effort was the ultimate physical admission that the German army was permanently in retreat and could no longer successfully contest the open steppes through maneuver warfare. The strategic necessity of building this massive, permanent defensive line solidified the permanent shift to strategic, manpower-intensive defense across the entire Eastern Theater. The permanent, irreversible loss of the Sixth Army, combined with the catastrophic casualties suffered at Kursk and throughout the subsequent retreats of 1943, represented the unrecoverable loss of an entire generation of Germany's most experienced military leadership and fighting men. These immense losses created a vacuum of experience, discipline, and tactical skill that could never be filled, guaranteeing that future German divisions would be inherently weaker, less disciplined, and dangerously reliant on poorly trained replacements and young conscripts. For Hitler, the eventual agonizing realization of this profound and irreparable demographic and experiential loss meant that any future German army would be a strategic and qualitative shadow of the one that launched the Blitzkrieg. By the beginning of 1944, the psychological, demographic, and strategic reality was tragically set. Stalingrad was the exact pivot point where the strategic goal of German victory was definitively replaced by the existential, fanatical drive for sheer survival, and eventually the ultimate, destructive goal of Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods. Hitler's command structure permanently transitioned from a quest for conquest and expansion to a desperate, destructive defense of his own regime, tragically willing to sacrifice the entire German nation to maintain his personal, absolute power. The entire trajectory of the final 2 years of World War II, the desperate defense, the chronic resource scarcity, the permanent loss of initiative was irrevocably preordained by the snows and rubble of Stalingrad in 1943.